You can say Missouri's been a disappointment so far in some ways, but it's also not nearly as bad as the naysayers think, and I'll explain why right now on Locked On Mizzou.
You are Locked On Mizzou, your daily podcast on the Missouri Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, all you true sons and daughters, I'm John Miller, your Mizzou mafioso and the central scrutinizer of Missouri Tigers football and basketball. On today's program, I want to tell you about two stats that Missouri actually leads the SEC in, one on offense and one on defense, quite surprisingly. So I'll reveal those here in just a little bit. First, though, let me remind you today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. And I have to say, I'm always astonished, perhaps naively so, by the amount of negativity you can get after a simple loss of a football game on the internet. One watcher, one viewer named Thomas, in fact, went as far to say that the Missouri program looks broken at the moment. That is quite the dramatic statement, considering Missouri has lost 3 games so far in the past season and a half. And so I think it is a good time, though. Again, we are halfway through the season here. Not a bad time to actually take a look at the Tigers. What are the strengths and the weaknesses of this team? Because halfway through right now, I had to actually stop and think about it for a second, because this is a bit of an unusual Missouri team in a way, because I'm not really entirely sure what Missouri's identity is outside of Luther Burden being an excellent talent. Really, if you want to get really basic, the strength of this team is Luther Burden III. And you could argue that Missouri hasn't even gotten him the ball enough offensively. I'd argue maybe a few more jet sweeps here and there, especially after what you saw against UMass. But just taking a broader look at the entire team, offensively, hey, here's your big reveal, by the way. A strength for Missouri offensively so far, the fewest 3-and-outs in the SEC. So Missouri is definitely sustaining drives more often than not. By the way, the last team who has twice as many 3-and-outs was 16 to Missouri's 8 in the conference, the Alabama Crimson Tide. So obviously the Tide a lot more explosive than Missouri, so they're able to make up for some of that production, but it also causes some long droughts for the Tide like we saw in that Georgia game. Now, defensively, Missouri has also forced the most 3-and-outs in the SEC, 32% of the time. And these stats, by the way, these defensive stats are just SEC-only games, so an even smaller sample size of just Texas A&M and Vanderbilt. But considering Missouri's, lack of production against Texas A&M, still notable there. But the worst team in terms of forcing 3-and-outs so far defensively in the conference, strangely, again, it's the Alabama Crimson Tide. What do we make of that? Well, probably a couple reasons there why the Tide struggled against South Carolina, had that big drought against Georgia, and also lost to Vanderbilt, of course. Now, really, when you look at this Missouri offense compared to the rest of the conference, and to me, that's the more interesting comparison. Give me the SEC, that just comparison versus Missouri against Ball State, for instance. I'm not really sure what exactly that's telling me one way or the other. But I'll tell you this, offensively, Missouri is kind of the definition of average right now. Very middling in just about every category offensively, save those 3-and-outs. Not really good or bad, just merely average. Some of those stats, a little bit above average, a little below, but end of the day, I'd say right there, middle of the pack. It kind of paints the picture of an offense that takes care of the ball well, no question about that. Cook with just 1 interception so far. But also weakness-wise, clearly Missouri's explosive plays have not been where Missouri fans wanted it to be, and only Oklahoma is actually worse in terms of explosive pass play percentage. And by the way, the Sooners are worse than Missouri by a country mile. The Sooners have really struggled offensively. By the way, though, you know who's number one in explosive pass play percentage? The Florida Gators. So congratulations to Locked On Gators host Brandon Olson for that. I'm sure that really helps him sleep at night that the Gators have been chucking it deep successfully more than anybody in the conference. Unfortunately, as you can see, though, that doesn't always necessarily equal wins and losses. You got to be able to sustain drives and not just hit the occasional big one over the top. But speaking of those big ones over the top, well, on the ground, too, the Tigers are also a good running team. Again, a solid running team. But on the lower end, on explosive run plays, it's not just the passing game, but Missouri not popping as many explosive run plays maybe as they were last season either. The bottom line for the Tiger offense, though, really, as much as we've talked about the deep passing game and pass protection and Brady Cook, and certainly Cook in the pass protection can definitely be better. I think we can all agree with that. But when you get down to it, really, the Tigers just simply need to convert more scoring opportunities into touchdowns. While the Tigers are taking care of the ball, their percentage on scores in the red zone is great. They're among top 10% in the country, that kind of thing. But just far too often, Missouri is settling for those field goal opportunities. Again, the stats paint a picture of a fairly conservative offense, but one way or the other, it's going to be an effective offense and a well above average offense if the Tigers just get the ball into the end zone. So again, explosive run plays, explosive pass plays, that's all fine and dandy, but the Tigers got to find a way to convert 3rd and 1s, 4th and 1s, 3rd and 2, that type of deal, especially as the field starts to shrink. Now, defensively, I've got a lot less to work with here in terms of these advanced stats. For some reason, only the SEC versus SEC competition is available here. So we're only talking about the Vanderbilt and Texas A&M games for Missouri here as far as the numbers go. And while there are some encouraging numbers, I mentioned, hey, the Tigers lead in 3 and outs. Wonderful. That's great. But unfortunately, they're second to last in touchdowns allowed. Only Mississippi State is worse, by the way. And they have the fewest takeaways so far, percentage-wise, in SEC play as well. Some of that can look a lot better if Dalen Carnell hangs on to that interception, for example. Again, this is the perils of small data points here. But bottom line is, defensively against SEC competition here, I would say the Tigers have been average to below average in most metrics. Not a huge surprise when, well, Vanderbilt had a pretty easy time moving the football, and Texas A&M in particular roasted the Tigers. Let's be real with ourselves. But the Tigers have also completely blown the doors off of 3 teams that obviously had no chance against Missouri in retrospect: UMass, Buffalo, and Murray State. The Tigers just destroyed all 3 of those teams. So bottom line is, yes, Missouri, I'd say, is a fairly safe and efficient offense, aside from Texas A&M, of course. That's a really big asterisk, no question. But really, an offense that if it just takes advantage of its scoring opportunities with a few more touchdowns, looks completely different on paper. So whether it's either through explosive plays, runs, or passes, by the way, or with just simply better red zone play, of course, Missouri had some go into the end zone, by the way, whether it was Luther Burden against Kansas State or Marquise Johnson multiple times, Burden against Georgia, that type of thing. Missouri just hasn't had that luxury as of yet. And yes, of course, the pass protection needs to be better. Of course, Brady Cook needs to be better, particularly when he's under pressure. But one way or the other, you score a few more TDs when you have a chance. This is an above-average offense, not just nationally, but in the SEC. More or less what I was expecting, if not maybe the absolute ceiling for the team. Now, defensively, there really is one big concern with the Tigers. And I want to explain exactly what I think that concern is coming up here on the program in just a little bit. But first, Locked On Mizzou fans, it is time for the Roy Player of the Week. So far this season, we've pooled more than $10,000 to support players on Roy. Micro deposits lead to a massive change, and with the Roy app, you can direct your support to the athletes you love, ensuring that all funds go to the specific player you choose. Unlike collectives, you know exactly where your support videos and updates after the season. The best part, it's risk-free. If the athlete transfers or doesn't deliver the content, you get your money back. And this week, I'm supporting Corey Flagg. I just pitched in $100, and I'd love for you to join me too. Even $10 makes a big difference. Let's show Corey Flagg the love and keep him connected to our school. Remember, pay today, celebrate tomorrow. Your support sets your team up for success. Plus, don't miss out on Roy's exciting giveaway. Win 2 tickets to a game in November. Just download Roy, create an account, and enter referral code LOCKEDON, and you are entered. Already on Roy? Well, any contribution to an athlete's campaign also gets you entered automatically. No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited. Download Roy now. Join the NIL game with no subscriptions and no fees. And be sure to check us out on Instagram, Facebook, and X at Roy_return on you for more info. Roy, support the players, change the game. And thanks to the Locked On Podcast Network for acknowledging my 5th anniversary as a part of this network and a host of Locked On Mizzou. I can't really believe it's been 5 years in some ways. And then in some other ways, I think, wow, I have done a metric ton of these things. More than 1,000 episodes at this point. By the way, I forgot to actually celebrate that. Hey, congrats to me on 1,000 episodes as well. I need I don't know, some confetti or something. Maybe I'll put it in the background in post, but don't count on it. But regardless, if you've been listening to me over these last few years, you know in 2022 and 2023 when Missouri had some really good defenses for the most part, well, I thought the biggest key to those defenses was quite simple. Their ability to play aggressive man-to-man defense on the outside with Chris Abrams-Drain and Ennis Rakestraw. Well, apparently the NFL agreed with me. Both of those guys were significant draft choices. Neither one has made a huge impact in the league yet, but let's give them some time. Regardless, if I loved those guys so much as players and thought of their production so highly, well, obviously that had to be a big concern this offseason, and it absolutely was for me. And well, so far halfway through this 2024 season, I think it's got to remain my biggest concern, not just on the defense, but I would say on the entire team. And I have a longtime everyday listener, John, on YouTube, who says, quote, "Our cornerback play is bad. There were at least 6 blown coverages where the UMass quarterback didn't see the wide receiver overthrown or underthrown balls were the wide." Okay, we're back here, right? That continues. That's not going to happen against SEC quarterbacks and wide receivers. The only quarterback who played well in limited snaps was Marcus Clark. Pride has not played well in a single game. What is the problem with the wide receivers constantly getting past our cornerbacks? Well, as to specifically what the problem is with our cornerbacks, good question. I'm not really sure. I will say that I think Drayden Norwood has been pretty good this season. I don't think he's been as good as Rakestraw or Abrams-Drain were the past 2 years, but I do think he's been a good player, he being Drayden Norwood. Now, Toriano Pride, hard to disagree with you. He's been a real disappointment here so far in the transfer portal. And Missouri just in general against Texas A&M, the defensive backfield, yeah, I'll agree with you. It simply wasn't up to snuff. And far too often, not just against Texas A&M, but of course, even against Vanderbilt and Boston College, just too many explosive plays over the top of the Missouri secondary, not just the corners, but of course, Marvin Burks at safety, and everybody else has a responsibility and a hand in the underwhelming play on the back end. So I hate to agree with my everydayer there, John, not because he's not a smart guy, because he is a smart guy. He follows the sport very closely. He called 10-2 for the Tigers last season before I saw anybody else do it. So I'm not just throwing this comment out here flippantly. I'm doing it because, frankly, I pretty much agree with it. I picked some nits on it. I think Norwood's been pretty good, but I have to agree that against UMass, far too often, I saw receivers that were wide open, only for the quarterback not to be able to get him the football, either through his problems, the pass protection, whatever you want to call it. Regardless, to listener John's point there's no doubt that far too often, even in the UMass game, there were guys open downfield, and that's going to remain, I'm afraid, a concern for the rest of the season. And to a point, I was in a complaint that I had after the Texas A&M game. Well, defensively, I really felt like Corey Batoon at a certain point needed to dial up the blitz pressure. But guess what? When you don't have good cornerback play, that's a lot harder to do. So that's a totally fair counter to my criticism. The only thing I'll say is at a certain point, when you're already down 28 points or whatever it might be, whatever point you thought it was that Missouri should have been in desperation mode, at a certain point, when dropping back into coverage, the zone coverage isn't working. The man coverage isn't working. You're either getting carved apart with the pass or the QB run, or the running backs, by the way, are carving you apart too. At a certain point, you just got to try something different and hope for luck. Let's see if maybe Toriano Pride can play one-on-one under a total island and pressure instead of maybe reading things in zone coverage. I don't know. At least you have a chance to get pressure there at that point instead of just watching the same thing over and over again. But I did just want to point out that is a good counter, though. Hey, how do you expect me to be a blitz-heavy defense if I can't trust my defensive backfield? I don't have a great answer to that other than at a certain point, when you're down 28 points, that type of thing, it's desperation mode. What actual moment you think that was in the ball game? Well, your mileage may vary there, but I don't think you could have really complained if Missouri would have gotten beat for an explosive play if they try to blitz after nothing else worked either. And you know what? This is probably going to ruffle a few Missouri fans' feathers, but I'm going to go with it anyway. I think despite the loss of Missouri legend Harrison Mevis this offseason, I actually think the Missouri special teams overall are improved right now. So let's talk about why coming up here in just a little bit. But first, I want to remind you NFL fans that you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. And you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. And if you took my advice last week, well, what can I say? You're welcome. I messed up my Moana reference, but we're going to power through it anyway. But yes, if you didn't believe in the Philadelphia Eagles that they should be giving 8.5 points against anybody, well, congratulations. You cashed one. Hey, maybe you can cash a few more this week. I think my favorite bet this week, maybe not in the NFL. I haven't looked too hard and too deeply into the NFL slate, but Georgia and Texas. Give me the Longhorns, -3.5 at home. That's my favorite college pick at the moment. But regardless of what you're into, you got to be into it at FanDuel.com. So when it comes to Missouri special teams, again, I think overall it's been an improvement from last season. I don't know that you can say that about the offense or the defense so far, but I do think the Missouri special teams overall have been better. Now, if you want to say that you think Harrison Mevis last season was better than what Blake Craig has been so far this season, that's fine. I'll agree with you. I just don't think the difference has been as stark as maybe as you think it has been, because other than really an off game for Craig against Vanderbilt, no question, especially missing a kick from less than 30 yards is pretty. You never want to see that happen, obviously. It happened to Harrison Mevis in a tough moment in 2022 against Auburn. But for the most part, I think Craig has been really quite good. He's only 1 of 4 from the 40 to 49-yard range, but an impressive 3 out of 4 from 50+. So you add those together, you're talking about a 50% hit range from 40+ yards. And Craig clearly has enough leg. There's no question about that. And I think he's looked pretty solid for the most part, made all of his extra points, and made all of his kicks against UMass in a game where obviously the wind was a major factor in that ball game. So I think Craig, who we have to remember is just a freshman, I think he's going to keep getting better and more comfortable with experience. Also, once you get past 40 yards or so, even the great Justin Tucker, there's a lot of variance in terms of year to year, game to game, how accurate those type of kicks are. But what is consistent is your leg strength, which is why NFL teams, college teams continue to lean more on the leg strength part of that portion of the game. So regardless of your feelings on Craig, hey, you think Mevis was better last year? I agree with you. I'm not arguing that, but in the aggregate, I think because Luke Bauer, this version of Luke Bauer to me as a punter has been so much better than last year's version of Luke Bauer and the combination of Riley Williams. Just the fact that those two were bouncing back and forth between the job kind of tells you what you needed to know about the production there. Missouri wasn't satisfied with it. Well, this year, I think Bauer's been much improved. I think he's been obviously improved. Now, I don't know that there's pretty much zero chance that Luke Bauer is ever going to top the fake punt pass against Kentucky to Marquise Johnson. That's probably the greatest moment of his entire life outside of seeing the birth of his children, something like that. But certainly as an athlete, probably not going to get any better than that for Luke Bauer. I love that he had that moment. But just as the actual first part of his job, not being the greatest quarterback rating in Mizzou history, along with now I'm blanking. Sonny Riccio, there we go, the fake punt guy against Nebraska all those years ago. But really, I mean, Bauer deserves a lot of credit, I think, for his improvement this season. You can tell he worked on his craft this offseason. I think Missouri's been a huge beneficiary of it. And with Luther Burden back there still returning the punts, and the kicks are basically the same old deal, unfortunately, with kickoffs. Not a lot happening there explosively. And occasionally Missouri still gets caught on a squib kick or a short kick type of situation. That needs to be cleaned up, but that was true last season as well. So I think overall, at worst, special teams are a wash. But to me, I feel even slightly more confident with our special teams unit than I did last season. That's just my humble opinion. And a fun note here from our favorite Missouri historian, Tom Orff on X, says this date in Mizzou football history: homecoming 2005, Chase Daniel came in for an injured Brad Smith in the fourth quarter to lead the Tigers to a 27-24 overtime win over Iowa State. Tigers trailing by 10. And Daniel led Missouri to a field goal and a touchdown with 20 seconds left. Daniel with 138 passing yards in the final 9 minutes of the game. So that was the moment where you thought, boy, this Daniel kid really might be something special. Also, that injury to Brad Smith, undoubtedly a concussion, by the way. Missouri was honestly a little bit ahead of the curve, I would say, in terms of, hey, we're not going to let this kid stay out here with a concussion. 2005, you got to remember, this was well before there were major changes and awareness in the NFL, that type of thing. My memory is it wasn't until, 2010, 2011 before that push really began in earnest. So some credit there to Gary Pinkel, the Missouri training staff, for keeping Smith out in a situation where I think it was pretty obvious that he had a concussion in retrospect. And finally, I do want to just a quick thought here, sort of broadly about football and sports in general. This has been a long debate for the last decade plus or so, and it's about momentum in sports. To me, I've long been annoyed with the over talk of momentum. It's one of those things that I think announcers just love to talk about, like, oh, Missouri's got the momentum. Oh no, Missouri's lost the momentum, and this, that, and the other. My whole thing is then there's been the opposite, which is the people like me who get annoyed probably and like math and stuff. There's been a lot of advanced statistical analysis and that sort of thing that has tried to basically prove that momentum doesn't really exist, insofar as there's no real evidence that, say, after a big play, a blocked punt, a turnover, something like that, yes, obviously you get the benefit of those points and the field position, whatever it might be. But beyond that, compared to moments when you don't have those plays, there really isn't a lot of statistical evidence that says that momentum equals points or yards or anything like that. But I will just say this, to this idea, does momentum exist? Well, my question would be, do you think young people succumb to groupthink? Do you think people in general succumb to groupthink? Do you think people succumb to negativity? Oh, I think all of the answers to all of those questions are quite obviously yes. So I would just say that some things are tough to put down in a spreadsheet. I've said it before and I've said it again. Just because something can't be necessarily proven statistically, that doesn't mean it's not an actual existing psychological or social phenomenon. Again, if you think that young people, especially people who are college age, since we're talking about college football here, if you think that they succumb to groupthink, well, then clearly they can succumb to momentum as well. The ups and downs, the emotional swings of positivity, negativity, and all that good stuff. If you don't think that exists, well, then I don't think you really understand human beings in their nature, to be brutally honest. But hey, thanks as always for joining me here on Locked On Mizzou. Appreciate you sticking it out for that little diversion into the human mind. I think I just enjoyed Inside Out 2, which is why I'm thinking about this stuff. By the way, great movie, by the way. Definitely take the whole family out to that one. I highly recommend it. But until next time, I'll have more movie reviews for you next time right here on Locked On Mizzou.